The first time Mara Benton called the sheriff on me, she told the deputy my Wi-Fi was poisoning the neighborhood. I was standing barefoot on my own front porch, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold 10 minutes earlier, while she stood at the bottom step with her pearl earrings, her pressed white blazer, and that little leather folder she carried around like it was a badge from God. Behind her were two county deputies who looked like they had already realized this was not going to be the kind of call anyone bragged about later. And Mara looked me dead in the eye and said, "Mr. Hayes, your wireless equipment is operating illegally, and for the safety of this community, we need access to your home immediately." Now, I've had a lot of strange mornings in my life, but being accused of running some kind of criminal radio station because my son could stream basketball in the basement was a new one. I did not yell. I did not slam the door. I just looked past Mara at the deputies, then back at her, and I remember thinking, this woman has finally pushed the wrong button. Not because I was brave, not because I was some legal genius, but because she had made one mistake people like her always make eventually. She assumed nobody else knew how to read. To understand how we ended up on that porch, you need to know about Cedar Vale Reserve, which is one of those planned communities outside Springfield, Missouri, where every house looks just different enough to pretend it has character, but not different enough to upset the architectural committee. We had matching mailboxes, approved mulch colors, 3 approved fence stains, and a retention pond the developer called Lake Amber, even though everyone knew it was just a drainage basin with ducks, mosquitoes, and one extremely angry goose that chased jobbers like it had a mortgage too. My wife Claire and I moved there in late 2020 with our son Jonah after almost 8 years of renting, saving, and telling ourselves that one day we would get a place with a garage, a yard, and enough space that we did not have to hear the upstairs neighbor's treadmill at midnight. I work as a field network engineer for a regional grocery distributor, which is a fancy way of saying when scanners stop scanning and warehouses lose connection, people call me before they call their own mothers. So when we moved in, I did what I know how to do. I wired the house properly, ran Ethernet through the walls, installed a couple of ceiling access points, put a small equipment rack in the storage room, added battery backup, and built a little home network that was clean, secure, boring, and legal. Jonah called it mission control. Claire called it the reason I kept disappearing into the storage room after dinner. Both were there. The first time I met Mara Benton, she did not introduce herself. She just stood beside my driveway at 7:15 on a Saturday morning and said, "Your basketball hoop is 12 inches too close to the sidewalk." I was still holding a trash bag in one hand and a broken cardboard box in the other. And for a second I thought she was joking, because where I grew up, people usually said good morning before they started measuring your driveway. But Mara did not do jokes. She had been president at the Cedar Vale HOA for 5 years, and she had the kind of soft voice that made every sentence feel like a warning wrapped in tissue paper. I moved the hoop. Then came the notice about our front door, which Claire had painted a warm green that apparently leaned too botanical for the approved palette. Then came the notice about the storage bins on the side of the house, even though they were behind the gate. Then came the letter about holiday lights being visible past January 15, even though I had photos showing they came down on January 12th, because by then I had started taking pictures of everything, which is what a person does when they stop feeling like a homeowner and start feeling like a defendant. At first I tried to be reasonable. I answered politely, fixed what I could, asked questions when something did not make sense. I told myself Mara was just strict, maybe lonely, maybe one of those people who found comfort in order because life had not given her much control anywhere else. I was trying to be generous, which is a dangerous thing to be around someone who mistakes kindness for weakness. My neighbor Ron Ellison was the one who finally laughed me out of that idea. Ron lived 2 houses down, retired from the phone company, always had sawdust on his jeans and a half-rebuilt canoe in his garage, even though Cedar Vale had no usable water unless you counted the goose pond. I was standing in his driveway one afternoon, complaining about a fine Mara had issued over our trash cans being visible at 6,008 p.m., and Ron just shook his head and said, "Caleb, she does this to everybody she thinks will fold. The Patels, the McRaes, the young couple on Ashbury Lane, she wore them down, one notice at a time." Then he lowered his voice a little and added, "But she especially likes people who ask questions." I asked him why. Ron looked toward Mara's house at the end of the cul-de-sac, a big brick place with black shutters, perfect hedges, and 3 rental properties tucked behind it under different LLC names, and he said, "Because questions are bad for business." I should have asked him what he meant right then, But I was still in that stage where you think the world has rules, and if you follow them closely enough, nobody can hurt you. That stage did not last. The first network complaint arrived 2 weeks later, printed on HOA letterhead, signed by Mara Benton in blue ink, accusing me of operating enterprise-grade telecommunications equipment without board approval. It cited Section 8.6 of the Cedar Valley Community Standards, which sounded serious until I opened the binder and found Section 8.6 was about decorative fountains. Fountains, as in water features. As in, please do not install a 6-foot cherub spitting water toward your neighbor's patio. Nothing about routers, radios, access points, cables, switches, antennas, or anything remotely related to the internet. I wrote back with the exact language of the rule. Attached photos of my equipment labels. I explained that consumer and prosumer Wi-Fi devices were federally certified for residential use and asked her to identify the actual restriction she believed applied. She did not answer. 3 days later, she showed up at my door with a man named Wayne Collier, who ran the HOA landscaping contract and looked like he would rather be anywhere else on Earth. And she told me they were there to conduct an inspection of my communications equipment. I told her no, calmly, because the bylaws required written notice and a valid basis for interior inspection. Mara smiled at me then, not friendly, not even angry, just cold enough that I felt it in my teeth. And she said, "Mr. Hayes, people who have nothing to hide usually cooperate." I said, "People who know the rules usually follow them." Wayne looked down at his boots like he had just discovered something fascinating in the concrete. Mara held my stare for one long second, then closed her folder and said, "This can become official very quickly." I watched her walk down the steps, and for the first time since moving into that neighborhood, I felt something shift inside me. Not fear exactly. Fear had been there already, quiet and annoying, sitting in the corner of my chest every time I saw an envelope from the HOA. This was different. This was the moment I stopped wondering what I had done wrong and started wondering what she was trying so hard to keep hidden. That night, after Claire and Jonah went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with the HOA binder, a yellow legal pad, and a cup of coffee strong enough to qualify as a personal mistake, and I started reading every page, every amendment, every meeting note, every boring little paragraph Mara Benton was counting on the rest of us to ignore, and by 2 in the morning, I had found the first crack. The first crack was not in the Wi-Fi rule. Because there was no Wi-Fi rule, the first real crack was buried in a board amendment from 2018, page 74 of the governing documents, under a heading so dull it practically begged you to skip it. Financial Administration Revision. That was it. 4 words. Nothing dramatic, nothing that said, "Hey!" This is where one woman quietly took control of everybody's money. But when I compared it to the original Covenanters, my stomach tightened in that slow, unpleasant way it does when a small technical problem starts looking like a system failure. In the original documents, any withdrawal from the HOA reserve account over $1,000 required 2 signatures, the board president and the treasurer. That made sense. It was basic protection. Nobody gets to move community money alone. But the 2018 amendment changed that. One sentence, tucked into the middle of a paragraph about payment procedures, gave sole emergency spending authority to the board president for infrastructure-related expenses, with reimbursement approval to be reviewed at the next board session. That sounded harmless until I pulled the meeting minutes and saw that the amendment had been approved at a special meeting with only 9 days' notice. Cedar Vale's own bylaws required 30. Missouri nonprofit law made that even more complicated, and the meeting minutes showed 11 homeowners present. In a neighborhood of 162 homes, I sat there at the kitchen table, looking at that page, listening to the refrigerator hum and the house settle around me, and I remember whispering Mara, "What did you buy?" The next morning I walked down to Ron's garage with a folder under my arm. He was sanding the ribs of that canoe he was never going to finish, country music playing from a dusty radio. And when I showed him the amendment, he stopped sanding, not slowed down, stopped. Then he wiped his hands on his jeans and said, "You need to talk to Evelyn Price." Evelyn lived on Briar Court, drove an old silver Buick, and had the kind of front porch that made you feel guilty for not bringing pie. She had been the HOA secretary before Mara pushed her out, and Ron told me she still had boxes of old records because, as he put it, Evelyn throws away grudges slower than paper. When I called her, she was quiet for a few seconds, then said, "Honey, I wondered when someone would finally ask about that account. I went over that afternoon." Evelyn made iced tea, the real southern kind that could probably keep a child awake for 2 days, and she spread documents across her dining room table like she had been rehearsing this scene in her head for years. She had the original notice from the 2018 meeting, dated 9 days before the vote. She had handwritten notes from when she had asked for receipts on a $41,000 withdrawal labeled Shared Systems Upgrade, and she had 3 emails from Mara telling her the matter was operational and not subject to homeowner review. I read that phrase twice, operational and not subject to homeowner review. That is the kind of sentence people use when they do not want to say none of your business. Evelyn watched my face and said, she was not always like this. That surprised me. I expected anger from Evelyn, and there was some, sure, but underneath it was disappointment, which somehow felt heavier. She told me Mara had moved into Cedar Vale after a bitter divorce, bought 1 house, then 2 rental homes, then a third under an LLC tied to her brother. At first, Mara volunteered for everything. Welcome committee, landscaping committee, holiday decorating. People liked her because she made problems disappear. Then, slowly, the problems she solved became problems only she could define. A trailer parked too long, a fence stained too dark, a tenant she did not like, a homeowner who asked about invoices. Power did not make Mara loud, it made her calm. That was the part people underestimated. Loud bullies scare you at first, but calm ones exhaust you over time. They make you feel unreasonable for objecting. They bury you in process until surrender feels like peace. Evelyn reached into a folder and slid 1 more paper across the table. It was a vendor list from 2019. 1 name had been circled in blue ink, Ozark Signal Solutions. I had never heard of them, but the word signal lit up in my head like a warning light. I went home and searched public records. Ozark Signal Solutions had done small commercial wireless installations for farms, storage lots, private campuses, places where running cable was inconvenient. Their invoices, based on county procurement records I found later, were not cheap. And then I searched Mara's LLC, Benton Residential Services, and there it was, registered in March of 2018, 2 months after the amendment gave her emergency spending power. I did not have proof yet. I had shapes. But when you work in networks long enough, you learn that patterns matter before packets do. The next piece came because Mara could not leave me alone. 3 days after I refused her inspection, she taped another notice to my front door, which was funny because the HOA handbook specifically said all formal notices had to be mailed. But by then I had stopped expecting consistency from people who weaponize rules. This one accused me of operating unauthorized radio frequency equipment that could interfere with neighborhood safety systems. We had 1 gate camera that mostly recorded teenagers cutting through the entrance and a weather siren 2 miles away that did not belong to the HOA. At the bottom of the notice, Mara wrote that the matter had been referred to county law enforcement. Claire read it over my shoulder and said, "She called the sheriff? On your router?" I said, "Apparently my router has entered its villain era." Claire laughed, but it came out tight, because beneath the absurdity was something ugly. A person with community authority had decided that our home was something she could invade, fine, accuse, and now involve police with, all because I had told her no. The deputy came the following Tuesday evening. His name was Deputy Sam Alvarez, mid-40s, calm eyes, tired posture, the kind of man who had probably been lied to by every kind of person and learned not to react too quickly. Mara arrived with him, of course. She stood slightly behind his shoulder, not close enough to look like she was directing him, but close enough to enjoy it. "Mr. Hayes," Deputy Alvarez said, "we received a complaint about unlicensed broadcast equipment at this residence. Would you be willing to show me what you have installed?" I looked at Mara, then at him, and I said, "Absolutely." Mara blinked. She had expected resistance. She had built the whole scene around resistance. But there is a wonderful little pleasure in opening the door for someone who was invited there to find a crime and knowing the only thing waiting downstairs is labeled correctly. I took Deputy Alvarez to the storage room. He looked at the rack, the access points, the battery backup, the cable management that I will admit I was proud of, and he asked better questions than Mara ever had. Power levels, certification labels, frequencies, external antennas. I showed him everything. He photographed the FCC labels. He asked if anything transmitted outside standard residential band. I said no. He nodded, wrote something down, then asked to see the HOA notice. I handed it over. He read Section 8.6, then looked up at me and said, "This section is about fountains." I said, "Yes, sir, decorative ones specifically." His mouth twitched once, the tiniest, almost laugh, and then he went professional again. Upstairs, Mara was standing in the hallway, arms folded. Deputy Alvarez told her there did not appear to be any violation. Mara's face did not change much, but her ears went red. That was when she made the mistake. She said, "Deputy, with respect, I have a resident 3 streets over who detected a commercial signal coming from this direction." Alvarez looked at her and said, "From this direction? Not this address?" Mara hesitated. Just half a second. But half a second could be a confession if someone is listening. Alvarez asked who detected it. Mara gave him a name, Gary Voss, a former cable installer who lived near the back loop and liked to tell people he understood telecommunications because he once mounted satellite dishes in 1996. Alvarez stepped out to his cruiser to make a call. Mara waited on my porch like she still owned the moment. She gave me that same cold smile and said, "This could have been avoided if you had cooperated from the beginning." I said, "Mara, I did cooperate." "That seems to be the problem." She looked away first. 20 minutes later, Deputy Alvarez came back with a different expression. Not dramatic, just focused. He asked Mara if she operated any wireless equipment from her residence or rental properties. Mara said no so quickly it sounded rehearsed. He asked if Benton Residential Services provided internet or connectivity services to tenants. She said that was a private rental matter. Alvarez closed his notebook. "Ma'am," he said, "county records show a commercial point-to-multi-point wireless unit registered to an equipment warranty address on Laurel Bend Drive." That was Mara's street. The silence after that was beautiful in a way I'm not proud of, but I will not lie about it. It was beautiful. Mara said she had no idea what he was referring to. Alvarez did not argue. Good deputies do not need to win porch debates. They just document. He told her the matter would be referred to county code enforcement, then turned to me and said, "Mr. Hayes, your equipment appears compliant. Thank you for your time." After they left, I stood in the doorway watching Mara walk back to her Lexus, shoulders stiff, folder pressed against her side like it might protect her. Claire came up behind me and said, "What just happened?" I said, "I think she called the sheriff on my Wi-Fi and accidentally pointed him at her own antenna." By midnight, Ron, Evelyn, and I were on a 3-way call, and by the next weekend, we had the outline of what Mara had been hiding. On her roof, behind a decorative chimney chase, was a commercial wireless relay, not huge, not obvious from the street, but visible from the county aerial imagery if you knew what to look for. It appeared to feed internet service to at least 5 rental units tied to her LLC, and tenants were being charged a monthly technology maintenance fee. The permit office had no record of a variance. The HOA had no record of approving commercial equipment, and the reserve account had that old $41,000 withdrawal labeled Shared Systems Upgrade. With Ozark Signal Solutions on the vendor list, it was not proof in court yet, but it was enough to stop playing defense. Evelyn called an attorney she knew from her old board days, a woman named Denise Caro, who had the gentle voice of a librarian and the email style of a guided missile. Denise reviewed the amendment, the meeting notice, the withdrawal records, and the code complaint that Deputy Alvarez had triggered. Her advice was simple. Do not accuse Mara in gossip. Do not corner her privately. Do not give her a chance to make herself the victim. Build the process. She cannot dodge. Under the bylaws, homeowners could force a special meeting with signatures from 55% of deed holders. That meant 90 signatures. We got 96. It took 3 weeks, 40-something conversations, 5 pots of Ron's terrible coffee, and more fear than I expected. People were not apathetic. They were tired. Mara had trained them to believe resistance came with a bill. One woman showed me a $600 fine for a mailbox post that had been approved 3 years earlier. A widower named Frank admitted he paid $1,200 over a shed because he did not want trouble after his wife died. Every signature felt less like paperwork and more like somebody standing up after sitting too long. When Mara received the petition, hand-delivered and certified mailed, she did exactly what Denise predicted. She tried to scare people. Her attorney sent letters saying the petition was invalid, that homeowners could be personally responsible for legal costs, that the board reserved all rights. Denise answered in 1 page and copied the county prosecutor, the code office, and a reporter named Lacey Ford from the Springfield Ledger, who had already started asking questions after someone posted the Wi-Fi story in a local Facebook group. Then Mara tried something uglier. She visited 3 homeowners who had signed and hinted that pending violations on their properties might go away if they withdrew. 2 told us immediately. 1 withdrew. We still had enough. The meeting was scheduled for the first Saturday in December, and 2 days before it happened, Mara sent an email at 11:38 p.m. announcing the meeting was postponed pending procedural review. Denise filed an emergency motion the next morning. By Friday afternoon, a judge ordered the meeting to proceed. And early Saturday, just as the sun was coming up and I was standing in my kitchen listening to the soft buzz of my perfectly legal equipment in the storage room, my phone rang. It was Peter Lang, the HOA treasurer, a quiet accountant who had spent years letting Mara handle things because peace is seductive when conflict has teeth. His voice was shaking. Calaby said, "She came by my house last night. She wanted me to sign an approval memo for the 2019 systems upgrade, backdated." I gripped the counter and asked, "Did you sign it?" "No," he said, and then his voice broke a little. "No, but I should have stopped this years ago." I did not know what to say to Peter at first, because there are confessions that sound like regret, and then there are confessions that sound like a man finally hearing his own conscience after keeping the volume low for too long. I told him to write down exactly what happened, the time Mara came by, what she asked him to sign, what the memo said, and whether anyone else was there. Then I called Denise, then I called Ron, then I woke Claire, who sat up in bed, listened for 30 seconds and said, "Do not go in there angry. Go in there clear." That was my wife in one sentence, always cutting through the noise to the only thing that mattered. By 9:30 that morning, the Cedar Vale Clubhouse parking lot was full, not busy, full. People had parked along both sides of the street, on the grass shoulder near the entrance, even beside the sad little sign that said Lake Amber Nature Walk, which was generous because the only nature anyone had seen there lately was that goose committing emotional crimes against joggers. The clubhouse smelled like burnt coffee, floor cleaner, and nervous people. Folding chairs scraped against tile. Neighbors who had not spoken in years stood shoulder to shoulder, whispering over printed packets, old notices, fine letters, photographs, all the paper cuts Mara had given them over time. Denise stood near the front with one slim folder. Lacey Ford sat in the second row with a notebook. Deputy Alvarez leaned against the back wall, off-duty but present, calm as a fence post, and beside him was a county compliance officer named Karen Whitmore, a woman with grey hair, rectangular glasses, and the terrifying stillness of someone who had read every document before entering the room. Mara walked in at 9:58. I will never forget her face. She had dressed for control, navy suit, pearl earrings, perfect hair, leather folder tucked under one arm. The control only works when the room agrees to pretend you have it. That room did not agree anymore. She saw Denise. She saw Lacey. She saw Deputy Alvarez. Then she saw Karen from the county, and something small changed around her mouth. Not fear exactly. Calculation failing. She opened the meeting by saying the gathering remained procedurally defective and that the board did not recognize any motions made under duress, misinformation, or harassment. Denise stood before Mara finished. "The court has ordered this meeting to proceed," she said, "and the homeowners have the floor." There was no drama in her voice, which somehow made it worse for Mara. Drama gives people like Mara something to fight. Calm gives them nowhere to hide. The first vote was to rescind the 2018 Financial Administration revision because proper notice had not been given and because the amendment conflicted with the original reserve account protections. Denise explained it in plain English, not like a lawyer showing off, but like a neighbor handing you a flashlight. The old rule required 2 signatures. The new rule gave Mara emergency spending power. The new rule was passed after 9 days' notice, not 30. Evelyn stood up, small and steady, holding the original meeting notice in a plastic sleeve like a church relic, and said, "I kept this because I knew someday it would matter." The vote was not close. 102 in favor, 6 opposed, 8 abstaining. Mara tried to object. Nobody moved. Then Peter stood. I saw his hand shaking before he spoke. He cleared his throat, looked at the floor, then raised his eyes to the room. "Last night," he said, "President Benton came to my home and asked me to sign a backdated approval for the 2019 Shared Systems Upgrade expenditure. I refused. I am stating that for the record." The room went so quiet I could hear the old soda machine humming by the hallway. Lacey's pen moved fast. Mara turned toward Peter with a look I'd only seen once before, when a supervisor at work realized the backup lobs had survived a server crash she caused. Pure panic disguised as offense. "Peter," she said softly, "be very careful." And for the first time since I had known him, Peter did not shrink. "No, Mara," he said. "I think I am finally being careful." Karen Whitmore stepped to the front after that, and if Mara still believed she could talk her way out, Karen removed that idea piece by piece. She did not call it fraud. Government people rarely use the word that makes the room gasp unless the paperwork is finished. She called it apparent misuse of association funds, undocumented expenditures, and commercial activity inconsistent with residential filings. Then she laid out the preliminary findings. The $41,000 shared systems upgrade had been paid partly to Ozark Signal Solutions. The work description matched a commercial wireless relay system. A matching relay was documented at Mara's residence on Laurel Bend Drive. No variance had been approved. No HOA vote had authorized a private wireless business, and tenant statements showed monthly technology fees paid to Benton Residential Services. Mara stood up then and said the equipment had benefited community connectivity. Deputy Alvarez spoke from the back before she could build the sentence into anything larger. "Mrs. Bell." "Benton," he said, "you may want counsel present before continuing." He did not threaten her. He did not raise his voice. He just put the truth on the table and let it sit there. Mara closed her mouth. That was the moment the neighborhood changed. Not when the votes passed, not when Karen spoke, not even when Peter found his spine, but when Mara Benton, who had spent years making other people explain themselves, finally had no safe explanation left. The board voted to remove her spending authority immediately, appoint an interim finance committee, freeze all reserve withdrawals over $500, and open the full records to outside audit. Mara left before the meeting ended. She did not storm out. That would have given her too much dignity. She just gathered her folder, walked down the center aisle while nobody spoke to her, and pushed through the door into the cold December light. Through the clubhouse window, I watched her stand beside her Lexus, phone pressed to her ear, one hand on the roof like she needed the car to hold her up. I thought I would feel victorious. I did not. I felt tired, then sad, then lighter than I had felt in months. Claire found me near the coffee table and squeezed my hand. Jonah, who had sat through the entire meeting pretending not to care, bumped my shoulder and said, "So your illegal Wi-Fi saved the neighbor." I said apparently. It was very community-minded. The audit took 5 months. Mara resigned before Christmas. The county denied her variance and ordered the relay removed. About $27,000 was tied directly to the wireless setup and related vendor payments. More than $50,000 in total expenditures lacked clean documentation. Some of that is still being fought in civil court, so I cannot tell you every ending, but I can tell you this. Peter repaid part of his board stipend voluntarily, even though nobody asked him to. Evelyn became interim secretary again. Ron finally finished half the canoe, which is progress if you know Ron. The HOA refunded several fines, including Frank's shed fine, and replaced the old punishment first policy with a warning and cure period. The reserve account now needs 2 signatures and outside bookkeeping. As for Mara, some people say she was a thief. Some say she was just a control freak who convinced herself every shortcut was justified because she was the only competent person in the room. I think the uncomfortable truth is usually somewhere in the middle. Power did not turn her into someone else. It gave her permission to become who she had been protecting herself from becoming. And maybe that is why this still bothers me. Because Cedar Vale did not fall apart because one woman wanted control. It fell apart because too many decent people got tired, got busy, got scared, and decided the rules were too boring to read. So here is my question for you. If your neighbor abused power for years, but the whole community let it happen because standing up was inconvenient, who is really responsible? Drop your answer in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from. And if you have ever dealt with an HOA, a landlord, a board, or anybody with a clipboard and too much free time, I want to hear your story. Because sometimes justice does not start with a lawsuit or a speech. Sometimes it starts with one tired homeowner, one ridiculous complaint, and a router that was never illegal in the first place.